Welcome to the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Hamas plans to launch a wave of terror in Israel. Trump hopes to win over Europeans for anti-Iran front. U.S. stops Turkish anti-Kurd advance on Manbij and Iraq. No breakthrough on Iran nuclear talks between the EU and Iran. Iran-backed Houthi missile strikes escalate. And now to our top headlines. Since early February, the Palestinian Hamas terrorist organization has been described by experts as a declining force, with internal disputes and a loss of credibility over the economic and humanitarian disasters. Last week, however, the truth was revealed that Hamas has been spreading false propaganda to create a sense of tragedy, while meanwhile planning a huge operation. Hamas has an agenda of protests lasting 6 weeks, which will culminate in the May 15th 70th anniversary of Israel's independence, which the Palestinians call Nakba Day. The IDF has reported that the first stage of Hamas' March of Return this past Friday left 17 Palestinians dead and 750 injured. There were no Israeli casualties. Most of the casualties occurred when 15 groups tried to rush the border and attack the IDF with firearms, rocks, firebombs, and explosives. The clash has continued on Saturday with 25 Palestinian casualties. Hamas is planning the protest march over the next 6 weeks, with the next major assault predicted by the IDF to take place on April 17th, the annual Palestinian Prisoner Day. Israel's security chiefs see the potential for the anti-Israel violence to spread to Palestinian areas in Judea and Samaria, with rioting and attacks on Israel targets billed as, quote, peaceful protests. Returning to Gaza, IDF spokesman Brigadier General Ronen Manelis told reporters, quote, "We won't let this turn into a ping-pong zone. If this continues, we will have no choice but to respond inside the Gaza Strip." UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an inquiry of the 17 Palestinian deaths in riots against the Israeli border. Israel responded that there is no equivalence between a sovereign state acting in self-defense and a terrorist organization that sanctifies the murder and death of Israelis. Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman said there will be no inquiry into the Gaza border deaths as demanded by the U.S. Secretary. He wrote on his Twitter account, quote, "I don't understand the chorus of hypocrites that want a commission of inquiry. They are confused and thought Hamas organized the Woodstock Festival and we needed to give them flowers." With us to discuss these issues is Dr. Martin Sherman, Director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So can the IDF persist in its present policy for keeping Gazans from surging across the border?
Well, it depends how it handles it. As opposed to most commentators that I've heard in the last few days, I consider this a grave strategic threat. And I believe that it should be treated as an act of war, and anyone participating in it should be treated as an enemy combatant and be prepared to face the risks that entails. And they should know, as a matter of certainty, that if they try to infringe Israeli sovereignty, they will be cut down. Just imagine if out of these tens of thousands, a few hundred managed to infiltrate an Israeli settlement or an Israeli community close by and butcher the residents and rape the women and raze the houses. What is Israel supposed to do? This is something that Israel must show zero tolerance for. And I think moderation here is only going to prolong the problem. You have an algorithm according to which when you have an outburst of violence, you confront it with minimum force. But that force doesn't deter, it only immunizes against fear. And so the next time the enemy comes, they have with greater force, and you have to confront it with minimum force, which now is a little more than it was before. And so eventually this spirals out of control. And I think that Israel needs to make it quite clear that it will use overwhelming force to terminate this initiative by Hamas Otherwise, I think it could degenerate into something very serious.
How do you think Hamas was able to get away with these lies for so long, duping leaders around the world as well as the IDF?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by duping, whether they managed to keep it secret or whether they managed to persuade the world that their narrative is the correct one. If you're talking about the second possibility, I think much of the blame must fall on Israel. Israel has been miserably derelict in handling its public diplomacy. It's allotted minuscule amounts of resources to present its case to the world. I've been advocating for a long time now that Israel should allot at least 1% of its state budget for public diplomacy to present its case to the world, to discredit the Palestinian narrative. And by the way, 1% is over $1 billion. You can change a lot of minds and win over a lot of hearts with $1 billion budget. So that's the one thing. The other thing, I think that Israel has really impaled itself on a deadly dilemma by embracing the two-state paradigm, because it necessarily makes itself appear disingenuous and deceitful. Because on the one hand, you declare that you're for a Palestinian state. On the other hand, no responsible government can make the kind of concessions that requires. And therefore, there's always this gap between Israeli declarations and Israeli actions. And I think the sooner that Israel jettisons its embrace or its acceptance of the two-state paradigm, I think it will find its diplomatic position much easier to present.
There were about 17 casualties, 750 injuries on Friday. Do you believe the violence will escalate over the next couple of weeks?
Well, I think that must be the working assumption, because the Palestinian leadership has certainly pledged that it will continue. And I think that we should take this very seriously.
The turbulence in Gaza is predicted to spread to the West Bank. Do you think the IDF will sustain the high level of preparedness for the next 6 weeks?
What option does it have? And I think this is a great danger, because it's one thing in Gaza, which has a 50-kilometer border with Israel. It's another thing in Judea and Samaria, which has a 500-kilometer border with Gaza. And so this could really pin down a lot of forces unless Israel takes very assertive action, very robust action, to convey to the Palestinians that this will not be tolerated.
And being that it will be on Gaza, how will this affect the preparedness on other fronts, the northern borders, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria?
Well, it certainly will draw off a lot of resources, and this is one of the reasons that it must be treated with such assertiveness and robustness.
That's Dr. Martin Sherman. Thank you very much for your insight today.
Thank you for having me.
Last Monday, Trump ordered 60 Russian diplomats out of the U.S. and shut down the Seattle consulate. U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis spoke at the Pentagon about the expulsion.
We obviously stand united with allies that believe in the rule of law, of a rules-based order, and whether it be North Korea using a weapon mass destruction somewhere, or any other country, we are against the use of weapons of mass destruction, especially when they're violations of treaty, notably when they're violations of treaty.
Until last Monday, Trump did not blame Moscow for the nerve agent attack on the former Russian double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, which went against the demands of the UK Prime Minister Theresa May. But he changed his mind when he saw the spy issue as an opportunity to try and parlay it into the European Union's support for his administration's stance on Iran prior to his May deadline for recertifying or scrapping the Iran nuclear deal. This week, 27 governments around the world threw out 140 Russian diplomats in the largest expulsion of Russian diplomats since the Cold War.
Well, I think we're headed towards a Cold War relationship to where back at the time of Cuban Missile Crisis, if you will, where there's going to be total adversarial relationships. I don't see at present, any places on the globe, including Syria, including Iran, where the United States and Russia are going to be aligned with one another.
State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert had this to say about the expulsion.
I want to remind you that there is no justification for the Russian response. Our actions were motivated purely by the attack on the United Kingdom, the attack on a British citizen and his daughter. Remember, this is the first time that a weapons-grade nerve agent, Novichok, has been used outside of war on Allied soil. We have not taken these steps lightly. We've taken these steps in concert with our allies across the world. 28 countries now join the United States backing our allies in the decision to have kicked out 153 Russian spies from the various countries. It appears that Russia has chosen to take the regrettable, unwarranted action to respond to our entirely justified action that I just covered. As I understand it, Russia plans to take the same unjustified actions against 28 other countries that stood in solidarity with the UK.
Trump plans to buy the country's backing for his strategy on the Iran nuclear deal. For this to happen, he made several demands on the European nations. First, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel must follow through with their demand for key concessions from Tehran to satisfy Trump that the flaws in the deal are fixed and to extend it for another 6 months. In addition, Europe must back him on his policies on Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. This would reconfigure NATO, the North Atlantic Alliance, as a broad-based, dynamic Western front after its recent expansion by the new members, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Trump would like to broaden it further by adding Arab Gulf oil governments and Middle East allies, Egypt and Israel. Trump emphasized to the Europeans that the Iranian nuclear deal would be separate from the Iranian-North Korean interaction on their nuclear aid missile programs. Trump is addressing the issue directly with Chinese President Xi Jinping and the North Korean ruler Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas and his French counterpart, Jean-Yves Le Drian, arrived in Jerusalem to speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu about the Iran nuclear deal. When Trump agreed that Merkel and Macron would broker the gaps between the demands of Washington versus Tehran, he insisted that Netanyahu would get involved. Trump was also motivated to join with the UK and European Union against President Putin over the poisoning of the ex-spy, as well as over the fact that Moscow has been helping Iran consummate its interests in Syria and Iraq. This undermines the U.S. position as leader of the Western world and of NATO. The Russian intelligence war with the UK is destroying the Western alliance's intelligence operations. In addition, Moscow is helping Iran fortify its military hold on Syria and assisting any party challenging U.S. positions in Syria, including Turkey, launching its Afrin operation against the Kurds of northern Syria, which are U.S. allies. Last Wednesday, Trump and May agreed on the necessity to take down the Russian spy networks in the West and remove Russian agents disguised as diplomats. In order to do this, Trump believes the U.S. must cooperate with the European spy agencies. In addition, the U.S. military released coverage of a NATO plane scanning all parts of Syria from Turkish airspace, which again demonstrated U.S.-European solidarity against Russia. Turkish President Erdogan said that his intelligence chief would meet an Iraqi official to discuss an Iraqi military operation in the northern Sinjar region, where Turkish Kurdish PKK fighters are based. The Iraqi government had begun a military operation in Sinjar, and the PKK forces were withdrawing from their bases as Iraqi troops were moving in.
Tel Rifat başta olmak üzere çevredeki diğer bölgelerin kontrolünü sağlamak üzere harekata devam ediyoruz. Bu arada Münbiş'te dahil olmak üzere Suriye'nin diğer bölgelerindeki terörist unsurlara yönelik planlamalarımız da sürüyor.
Debka intelligence sources report that Erdogan was concealing the fact that he had been forced to abandon his plan to capture Manbij, where the U.S. and U.S.-backed Kurdish YPG forces were deployed, and then to cross the border into Sinjar. Erdogan's plan was put on hold after a warning from U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, who described Turkey as a NATO ally and confirmed that the U.S. stands with Ankara. Mattis said that the Turkish army could no longer operate in Syria without coordinating with the U.S. He also claimed that if they run local militias in Syria, it will be attacked by U.S. militias, that the Turkish army must not advance from Afrin to Manbij, that they cannot continue to be a member of NATO while using Russian weapons, and that the U.S. will not allow Turkish troops to cross into Iraq. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas and French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian met with Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem to discuss Tehran and concessions that would convince U.S. President Trump not to scrap the Iran nuclear deal. Debka sources report that the two foreign ministers have reported progress in the negotiating process. The Iranians are ready to discuss the European terms, which would require Iran to affirm every 2 years its compliance with restrictions on its nuclear and ballistic development. This would allow U.S. President Trump to avoid throwing out the nuclear accord while allowing him to impose sanctions, which the European Union would support. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin commented on the visit by the French leader.
טוב יעשה העולם כולו כאשר הוא ישים לב שאיראן תומכת בטרור ולכן צריך להסביר לה שתמיכתה בטרור לא תוכל להתקבל בצורה אדישה על ידי העולם החופשי בעיקר, שצרפת היא אחת ממנהיגותיה.
However, the European Union resolutions did not satisfy any of the points that Netanyahu raised at the meeting. This includes getting rid of the sunset clause, which claims that when the accord expires in 2024, Iran will be free of restrictions on its nuclear program and will be allowed to reactivate its centrifuges for enriching uranium. Israel insists on those restrictions becoming permanent so that Iran will never be allowed to make a nuclear weapon. Although Maas and Le Drian told Netanyahu that Tehran could extend the expiration date but would not say for how long, Netanyahu was not satisfied. He stated, quote, Tehran can even today enrich enough uranium at a high level of purity to make atomic bombs. The two foreign ministers were hopeful about persuading Iran to stop developing, manufacturing, and testing long-range missiles on which nuclear warheads could be mounted. Yet Debka sources report that Maas and Le Drian offered no evidence to support a breakthrough. Despite former U.S. presidents' promise to allow inspections anywhere and any time to the International Atomic Energy Agency, Tehran has never given the inspectors access to its military sites. The foreign ministers hope to lure Netanyahu to convince Trump to accept the European plan and refrain from scrapping the deal by turning a new page in the continent's policy towards Israel. Debka sources state that their reports strengthen Netanyahu in his conviction that their initiative offered nothing to appease Israel's concerns about a nuclear Iran. After the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman met U.S. President Trump in the White House, Yemen's Houthi insurgents released a new short-range ballistic missile, which was test-fired at the Saudi Aramco oil facility in the southern province of Najran. Military experts report that it is a solid-fuel artillery rocket rather than a ballistic missile. Tehran told Washington to back off from European proposals for restrictions or sanctions on its ballistic missiles. Iran will continue to export missiles to its Middle East allies, including the Houthis in Yemen and Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Tehran has threatened that the more the U.S. helps the Saudi efforts in Yemen, the more ballistic missiles the Yemeni Houthis will shoot into Saudi Arabia. The Houthis launched 14 ballistic missiles against 4 Saudi military bases on March 25th. 7 were intercepted by Saudi air defenses, 3 were aimed at Riyadh, which killed 1 and injured several others, 2 hit the military towns in the southern province of Jazan. The Houthi missile strikes are Tehran's attempt to sabotage the Saudi Crown Prince's plans to visit Baghdad before Iraq's general elections on May 12th, which could cause friction between Iraqi Shiites and Tehran. The spokesman of the Saudi Arabian-led intervention in Yemen had this to say at a press conference in Riyadh.
كافة الأدلة تدل على استمرار تصعيد خطير من النظام الإيراني في تزويد الميليشيا الحوثية المسلحة وكذلك أي منظمات إرهابية بما فيها المنظمات تهريب الأسلحة بصواريخ باليستية وأنواع كثيرة من الأسلحة النوعية. القصد من هذا تحقيق أجندة معينة، نشر الفوضى، إعطاء نصر وهمي.
Meanwhile, in Yemen, 3 out of 4 people rely on humanitarian aid to survive. More than 8 million are on the brink of famine, and over 10,000 have died from illness and lack of access to medical treatment outside the country. There are over 2.4 million people who have been displaced from their homes. The U.S. representative to Yemen, Martin Griffith, had this to say about the war.
I've spent my time listening to the parties, to representatives from a broad range, and gatherings about the aspirations of the people of Yemen to end this war. All the people I spoke to, both here and in Riyadh, spoke of their strong desire for a political solution and to move quickly towards it.
And now for a roundup of this week's regional stories you may have missed, the news in brief. Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that Israel plans to launch a big data health project to make data about the state of health of its population available to researchers and private companies. Israel will invest up to 1 billion shekels in the project. Israel's 9 million citizens belong to 4 health insurance organizations, which keep members' records digitally. A statement from the Prime Minister's office has stated that the citizens' information would remain anonymous and would guarantee privacy and information security. In addition, patients will be able to refuse the use of their information for research. The oldest cases of breast cancer and multiple myeloma were found in the remains of mummies in the Egyptian city of Aswan. The discoveries were made by conducting CAT scans on 2 mummies found there. The findings show that the patients were members of the wealthy governing Egyptian families and that the society had the resources to support them through their illnesses when no other treatment was available. In Amman, Jordan, 800 pigeons congregated for a bird beauty pageant. This was the largest ever bird pageant, which brought together 500 breeders and 1,500 visitors. Mohammed Al-Mari, the organizer, has said that the competition is important because it introduces younger generations to bird breeding. The judges rated birds based on several qualities and traits and named 3 birds as the winners.
الآن طيور بلاد الشام كل طير له مواصفات خاصة فيه، يعني كل طير يحمل مواصفات معينة بتكمل جمالياته. هاي المواصفات إذا كانت يعني بامتياز عالي بيكون الطير حائز على المراكز المنافسة بالدرجة الأولى، أول وثاني وثالث. قمنا بالتحكيم على الطيور على حسب مواصفاتها.
احنا بنعشق الحمام وهذه هواية، هذه عالم وهواية، مثل اللي بربوا خيل، اللي بيعشقوا الخيل أو الإبل أو الماعز أو الصقور، هذه هواية. اللي بدنا نوصله انه بدنا نعرف كل الناس على الهوايه تبعتنا وبدها تكون واضحه وحتى الاجيال اللي من بعدينا تطلع عن علم تكون عارفاها وتستمر هذه الهوايه.
That's it for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Thanks for watching.